Okay, everybody, thank you very much for being here during today's webinar of the MirYam Institute. And we're here to give a situational briefing in the wake of what seems to be a holding ceasefire. Time will tell, but we are here in the recent operation in the Gaza Strip, a defensive operation, of course, and we're going to do this in two parts. My first guest today will be David Hacham. David Hacham served for 30 years in various intelligence and political strategic positions in the IDF, including 8 years in the Gaza Strip as advisor for Arab affairs to successive commanders of the Southern Command and the coordinator of government activities in the territories. David was actively involved, ladies and gentlemen, in the Oslo peace process, and he participated in the majority of meetings between Israeli leaders and Yasser Arafat. Following his military service, David was appointed advisor for Arab affairs to no less than 7 Israeli ministers of defense, including Yitzhak Mordechai, Moshe Arens, Ehud Barak, Binyamin Ben Eliezer, Shaul Mofaz, and Moshe Bogi Ya'alon. He's also the author of 2 books based upon his experiences. The first is Gaza in the Eye of the Storm, the inside story of the Intifada, and another book entitled And the Land Was Filled with Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and his war against Israel. David, it's wonderful to have you here with us as always. How are you doing, first of all?
Thank you very much for this introduction about me. I'm okay, everything is okay with me. Looking, of course, to what was happening in the Gaza Strip during the last military operation. And I hope things will be for the best in the future.
Well, I hope so too, from your lips to God's ears. I want to get right to it, David. And Yaakov, as I mentioned at the top, will come to you after my initial interview with David, and I'll intro you at that point. But look, David, for a little bit of context here, on Monday, August 1st, Bassam al-Saadi, the head of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the West Bank on Israel's eastern flank, was arrested in Jenin by Israel and our various security forces due to our belief that he was behind the military buildup of Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the West Bank, particularly in Jenin. So, David, nobody knows this topic better than you. Who is this man who was detained, Bassam al-Saadi? What type of force buildup was he attempting? And why does Israel decide suddenly that it has a vested interest in preventing such a buildup? And I ask that question because, in truth, force buildup in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, is an ongoing effort by several parties at play, including Hamas. Why did Israel suddenly decide to detain this man at this time?
First of all, it's not suddenly. You know, before Israel or the IDF, Israel Defense Forces, is going to arrest somebody in the West Bank, or when we were in Gaza, you have to collect all the necessary, evidence, all the necessary security material in order to arrest somebody and to have the justification for arresting him. And this Bassam al-Saadi was a very prominent, I would say, activist, terrorist of Al-Jihad al-Islami al-Falastini, operating in the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria, in the Jenin refugee camp. This is not the first time, by the way, that he was arrested and was in Israeli jails. He was beforehand several times. And when the material was coming to, I would say, to a threshold of having all the evidence and all the indications, of course, the decision is taken by the chief of staff, by the Shabak people, in order to arrest him and to bring him to interrogation. This time it was a very, I saw the scene of how he was arrested. It was a very, interesting, I would say, arrest taking place in the refugee camp of Jenin. But at the end of the day, the forces, the Israeli forces, the Israeli soldiers succeeded in arresting this guy, despite that there was some kind of resistance, but they hold him, and now is in interrogation in the Israeli side by the general, intelligence service and the military, the IDF military.
So, as a consequence of that arrest, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza readied themselves for a revenge or reprisal series of operations against Israeli soldiers and or civilians. It would have made no difference which would have fallen into the target range, soldier or civilian. Specifically, they were targeting those individuals who were traveling within range of sniper fire or anti-tank rocket fire, weapons fire, in Israel's southern periphery close to the Gaza Strip. And as a result of that, Israel closed the road system throughout part of southern Israel. Can you define for us, please, a little bit more clearly what the threat was? How clear and how imminent was that threat?
Yes. First of all, Al-Jihad al-Islami Palestini is not the biggest, movement inside the Gaza Strip area. And all of Gaza is being controlled first and foremost by the government of Hamas, by Hamas, movement. And this is the strongest force operating in Gaza since 2007, since what we call the coup d'etat against the Fatah members, against the Palestinian Authority, which ruled until June 2007, the Gaza Strip area. When they spoke about what happened, in the arrest of Bassam Saadi in Jenin, the Islamic Jihad people were speaking about retaliation, about being retaliated against the Israeli side for this arrest. In accordance with the intelligence information that the IDF had at that period of time, I'm speaking a couple of days ago, last week, they came to a conclusion that at the end of the day, Al-Jihad al-Islami is going to fire against Israeli, civilians and military alike. And this is why at the end of the day, we were like 3 or 4 days in a situation of waiting to see what's going on from the Jihad al-Islami side. But at the last moment, when you knew, in a very absolute way that the Jihad al-Islami people are going to fire against Israeli targets, Israeli civilian or military alike, the decision was taken to make this preemptive attack against Al-Jihad al-Islami infrastructure, military infrastructure inside Gaza. So it was, at the end of the day, I think everything was calculated by the IDF. And in the minute that this, threat by Al-Jihad al-Islami was real, serious, then the decision and the order was taken in order to fight and to take action against Al-Jihad al-Islami infrastructure, military infrastructure inside Gaza.
And on Friday, August the 5th, Israel eliminated Taysir al-Jabari, who has been described, please correct me if you take a different viewpoint, that he's been described as the top Islamic Jihad commander in charge of the terrorist group's rocket arsenal and its primary coordinator as well with Hamas. Israel also eliminated the head of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad's Southern Division, an individual named Khaled Mansour, who was involved in rocket fire against Israel during Operation Guardian of the Walls, which took place in May 2021. He was also killed by the IDF in a targeted strike. Now, David,
yes,
this is why it's so wonderful to have you as an expert with the MirYam Institute, because in July 2020, you wrote an analysis for the MirYam Institute, the exclusive analysis that people can see on your page on our website, about Israel's policy of targeted killings, something in which you were very, very involved during your long career. And you stated that, quote, remember, this is in July 2020, you wrote this, you said, quote, after a 5-year moratorium, Israel's targeted killings re-emerged in November of last year, when the IDF conducted a missile strike against the Northern Brigade commander of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Baha Abu al-Atta in Gaza. You went on to say, David, and this is what I want to dig into with you on this conversation, quote, targeted killings stir fear among those terrorists who seek to do harm. Their use pushes terror organizations into defensive positions. They have a paralyzing effect, at least temporarily. But on the other hand, it cannot be denied that the influence of this tool is ultimately limited and short-term. After the initial shock, new operatives rise up and fill the ranks. David al-Atta was eliminated and replaced by al-Jabari. Al-Jabari was just eliminated. Who will be his successor?
Look, I don't know exactly the name of the successor of al-Jabari, but for sure, as I wrote maybe in the article that you quoted before, somebody will come after him, and somebody will be appointed by al-Jihad al-Islami to take his role as the northern, division of al-Jihad al-Islami in the Gaza Strip, as well as regard to Khalid Mansour, who was the head of the southern, division of the al-Jihad al-Islami in the Gaza Strip. This is, I must tell you, I agree 100% with what you quoted before. I'll tell you why, not only because I wrote it and I think in this direction, but between us, we are talking about these targeted killings. And I think this is a must in terms of capabilities, in terms of actions that the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, with the cooperation with the Shabak, with the General Intelligence Service of Israel, can take against the terrorist infrastructure in the territories. Here we are speaking, of course, first and foremost about the Gaza Strip area. At the same time, when you are taking these kind of decisions, you know that this is not going to last in terms of influence for a long period of time. Because after a period of time, the Palestinian organization is taking the steps in order to fill the gaps, in order to appoint another commander. But at the same time, this is something which is very much frightening the terrorist organizations, Palestinian organization in both Gaza and the West Bank. And Hamas and al-Jihad al-Islami, number one fear. They are afraid, very much afraid of these targeted killings taking place by the Israeli side. And they are influencing time and again in the past, they were speaking about it, that Israel should not take this course of events or actions against the Palestinian side because they are going to retaliate. But I think at the end of the day, like a conclusion of this issue, that this is like a very important, I would say, action by Israel to be taken against the terrorist infrastructure of both al-Jihad al-Islami and Hamas in the territories in Gaza, basically in Gaza, because it's very much frightening them to take actions. But at the same time, we have to know that the influence of this mode of action is very limited in terms of time, in the future, because they are filling the gaps very shortly after the killing of these commanders.
Now, as we know, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad is a Sunni movement, but it's hugely dependent on supporters, first and foremost, the Shiite Republic of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. It's no coincidence that their leader, Ziad al-Nakhala, has spent recent days in Tehran with his backers, who are, of course, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The Palestinian Islamic Jihad is also dependent on the support of the Assad regime in Syria, and so on and so forth. Now, he was in Tehran when the fighting really began. I'm referring to Ziad al-Nakhala. What was the likely focus of that meeting that he was having with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, David? And where does he spend the bulk of his time, this man?
Yes. First of all, Benjamin, it's very much important for me to say something about Ziad al-Nakhala. Ziad al-Nakhala was born in the Gaza Strip area. Ziad al-Nakhala is from a refugee family, in his past. And Ziad al-Nakhala was deported from Gaza in 1988. This is to say, a short period of time after the eruption of the first Intifada in December 1987. And Ziad al-Nakhala, the basis of Ziad al-Nakhala is in Damascus. At the same time, he's in Beirut, in Lebanon, part of the year. And as a matter of fact, he's going and coming to other Arab capitals, as well as he was in Cairo during meetings with other, commanders of the Palestinian terrorist organizations. But this time you were right by saying that, in the very days of the Israeli operation in Gaza, Ziad Nachali was in Tehran, meeting the Revolutionary Guard commander in Tehran. And at the same time, I don't know if you saw yesterday, after 11:30 p.m., when the ceasefire was valid between Israel and Al-Jihad al-Islami through the mediation of the Egyptian military intelligence, he was in Tehran he was in a press conference in Tehran, giving declaration and speaking about what was happening in terms of this agreement with the Israeli side. What I would like you to know, the fact that Ziad al-Nakhali was in Tehran, I mean, it's not something coincidental, because you have to understand, and this is not from the beginning, but, after the establishment of Jihad al-Islami in the year 1981, and I knew all the leaders of Jihad al-Islami since the beginning. You have to understand that the very fact that Ziad Nakhali was in Tehran at that period of time is another indication for the fact that Al-Jihad al-Islami movement is not but a puppet of Iran in the Palestinian arena. It's like a branch of the Iranian Ayatollah's regime in the heart of the Palestinian arena. In this case, we are speaking first and foremost about the Gaza Strip area. And Iran is standing behind Al-Jihad al-Islami. And I would like you to pay attention to something very much important. As you have said before, correctly, the Ayatollah's regime in Iran is a Shiite, Shiite movement. The people in Iran.
Shiite regime. It's a Shiite
regime. Now, Al-Jihad al-Islami is not Shiite. There is no Shiites in the Palestinian arena, not in the West Bank, nor in the Gaza Strip. But there is an alliance, a strategic alliance, a strategic cooperation. And for Iran, this is not but a branch of Al-Jihad al-Islami organization movement in the Palestinian Authority. And Al-Jihad al-Islami is operating under the instructions, I would say under orders given from Tehran. And this is the main supporter of Al-Jihad al-Islami Palestinian movement, Iranian regime. And for many years, they gave them enormous financial support to the Islamic Holy War movement, to Islamic Jihad. And this is still going on. But beforehand, they gave him through the underground tunnels in Philadelphia line from Egypt. They gave him, arsenal of ammunition and military equipment and rockets, etc. And now they have the know-how how to manufacture, how to develop this arsenal of military equipment by themselves under the cooperation and with the assistance of the Iranian regime for Al-Jihad al-Islami al-Falastini. So the bottom line, Al-Jihad al-Islami al-Falastini movement in Gaza and in the West Bank at the same time is not but a puppet, a branch of the Ayatollah's regime in Iran. More than Hamas, by the way. Hamas is more independent in this regard, although Hamas has a very good cooperation with the Iranian Ayatollah's regime. But Al-Jihad al-Islami al-Falastini is considered to be like a pure puppet, a pure branch of Iran, of the Iranian regime inside the heart of the Palestinian arena.
And when you say pure, of course, you don't mean free of sin. What you mean is free of responsibilities, free of other considerations, meaning, for example, Hamas is required and has taken upon itself not only to seek the destruction of the state of Israel, but rather benevolently, when it comes to its own constituents, to offer welfare programs, medical treatment, so on and so forth in the Gaza Strip. And that makes their task rather larger than the singular task, the pure task, and that's the context in which you use the word pure, of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is to wage war against the state of Israel, no welfare, no broader programs, simply to do what it can to impede the state of Israel. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. You are correct, absolutely correct, because this is like the nature of Al-Jihad al-Islami. You have to know that Al-Jihad al-Islami has no whatsoever any political dimension in their activities. They are pure military terroristic organization, terroristic movement. And they have no concern about the standard of life of the Palestinian in Gaza, about the support, civilian support given to the population. And they are not having these kind of concerns like Hamas has in Gaza as the government, as the formal official government in Gaza. Hamas has to take into consideration and to be responsible for the standard of living of the population, to see that the population are not going to starve, are not going to be in hunger. But in this case, Al-Jihad al-Islami is free from this kind of concerns. And they are, focusing, concentrating, in a total way in the war, in like their name, Jihad, in the Jihad, the holy war against the state of Israel. At the end of the day, they would like to see the destruction of the Jewish state. They would like to see here an Islamic state being established, in the boundaries which are known, from the sea to the river, from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, as the Islamic, thoughts and purposes are guiding their activities of Al-Jihad al-Islami. At the same time, as I've told you before, Hamas is a military terroristic movement with no doubt, but at the same time, being the government in the Gaza Strip area, they have to take care and to be responsible for the living standard of the population in Gaza. I'm not saying that this is the first in the list of priorities. The first in the list of priorities of Hamas, like the Jihad al-Islami, is to see that they have, the military force capable of confronting the state of Israel. And this is something we have to take into consideration. But at the same time, being a government in Gaza, they have these, duties for taking care of the local population in Gaza.
Now, David, just before I come to the next question, I want to say something to our listeners and to our viewers. If you have questions, because David Hacham obviously is a wealth of knowledge on all of the subjects that he's speaking about today. If you have questions that stem from David's answers, or if you'd like to ask something disconnected from what David is discussing at the moment, Yaakov Lappin, who is our next guest, is in the background. He's our in-house analyst at the MirYam Institute. He's a military correspondent and a defense analyst for numerous publications. And if you type your questions into the Q&A section that you see at the base of your screen, Yaakov will answer in real time in written form. So I just want to encourage you, please, if you have any questions beyond what's being discussed, connected or disconnected from the subject at hand, please type them in the Q&A box and Yaakov will happily type his response to you live until his segment begins. Now, David, let's come on to that issue more squarely, which is that of Hamas, because you have written that at this stage, the impression, you wrote this, I should emphasize, just before the ceasefire came in, so I want to give that timing consideration to our listeners, but you wrote that at this stage, the impression is that Hamas is in no rush to get involved. And that's proven true and it's proven accurate. You were right again, David. But you go on to say that that was due to the fact that Hamas absorbed a painful blow from Israel's operation in May of 2021. Since then, you say Hamas has been licking its wounds, recovering militarily, rebuilding its rocket stockpiles, and encouraging civilian, economic, humanitarian rehabilitation efforts in Gaza as well. Now, David, therein lies the rub for me, because Hamas absorbed a painful blow in May 2021, but it is now in the midst of rebuilding its capabilities and readying itself for future conflict with Israel. It used to be, David, that Israel's conflicts with Gaza would be separated by 2 years or more. Cast lead took place in 2008, 2009, Pillar of Defense in 2012, Protective Edge in 2014, then Alel and Guardians of the Walls in 2021. And now another round comes in 2022, just over a year later.
Yes.
David, we've lost our deterrence, haven't we, in Israel?
Listen, I think that you are right in this regard. At the same time, it's only part of the answer, because I'll tell you frankly, the fact that Hamas has not, participated in this last round of hostilities with Jihad al-Islami is for me like a proof that what happened a year ago in May 2021 was a fatal blow to Hamas military infrastructure. And this is Hamas was very much hesitant not to participate, not to be involved in this round of combat with the state of Israel. And I think this was a proof that this was like a deterring action taken in the last military operation in May 21 as regards to Hamas. And this is why at the end of the day, there were a lot of speculations saying that maybe Hamas is waiting and will come to the battlefield. But at the end of the day, Hamas was refrained from participating and being involved in this round of hostilities, and let Al-Jihad al-Islami to be alone. And at the same time, I must tell you something very much important. Al-Jihad al-Islami wanted that this round of combat with the state of Israel will last more in order to bring Hamas to enter to the combat with the state of Israel. But at the end of the day, I think we were acting very much in a very clever way in order to see that, all the targets in Gaza of the IDF, of the Israeli Defense Forces, were absolutely Al-Jihad al-Islami targets, military targets. And we didn't touch anything related to Hamas inside the Gaza Strip area in order to put Hamas aside and not to press upon Hamas and not to influence Hamas and not to bring Hamas to enter the war with Al-Jihad al-Islami Palestinian. I'll tell you more than that. I talked with some people today in Gaza, and they told me that Al-Jihad al-Islami people are very much, disappointed from the stand, from the position of Hamas, not assisting them, not being involved in the war against Israel this time. And this is something which can bring a more, I would say, conflict between these two organizations, Hamas and Al-Jihad al-Islami al-Falastini in Gaza.
But this seems, I wonder, you say that we're acting very intelligently and very cleverly, maybe too cleverly. I mean, this seems to me like the most topsy-turvy, inverted, הפוך על הפוך consideration and logic imaginable. You have an enemy that is sworn to your distraction. Whether they can do it or not is irrelevant. Hamas is sworn to the distraction of the state of Israel and also to the elimination of the Jewish people. Okay, obviously we have a right of reply to that aspiration, but that's their stated perspective. Now we know that they're weakened as a result of the operation in May 2021 against them inside the Gaza Strip. Why on earth would we wait until they regain their strength in order to go at them again? If we have a weakened enemy and it's licking its wounds and it's lame and it's impeded, why not go in there and smash them again? I don't understand it.
Yeah, I'll tell you. What you are saying is very much logic, very much reasonable to hear it. But at the same time, you have to know the price of any military operation taken place by the IDF in the Gaza Strip area. First of all, I must tell you in this regard, you spoke about the weakness of Hamas after the last military operation of 2021, May 2021. It doesn't mean that Hamas lost all its power, all its military infrastructure. They still have the underground tunnels, despite the fact that, many tunnels were destroyed in May 21. At the same time, that huge, arsenal of rockets of explosive material, of anything, I mean, related to the military equipment. And this is something which is not going to be like a journey in the night in Gaza. You have to understand that number one issue from the Israeli side, which is like making like a condition or influencing any decision taken by the Israeli leadership to go to a military act, in this case in Gaza, is the number of casualties. And I'm speaking both about soldiers, young soldiers, and civilians alike. And if, you know, Israel will enter to Gaza to an overall, you know, operation, military operation, it will cost with the life of many Israeli, you know, civilians and soldiers alike. And this is why I think this is the main reason not to enter to a full scale, to a complete war against Hamas in Gaza. Secondly, I would like to tell you, I was in Gaza 8 years, as you spoke before, as you said before. And I know Gaza. I know every inch in Gaza. You know, Gaza is not, you know, a place like any town in the West, you know. Gaza is 8 refugee camps, is high rate of condensity, of density, populated area. I think Gaza is what you see, what only you see on the ground, but underground, and this has to be taken, of course, into consideration. And I'm not saying that at the end of the day, Israel won't be obliged in the future to do something more, you know, in terms of entering militarily to Gaza. But at this stage, I think that the decision is like very much clever from the Israeli side, taking into consideration another issue which has to be taken into consideration. And this is what I call the set of priorities of the Israeli state. And you know, Gaza is not at the top of the list of priorities from the point of view of Israel. At the same time, don't forget that number one threat to Israel, I would say even to Israeli existence, is Iran and the attempts to develop nuclear military capabilities by the Ayatollah regime in Tehran, which is number one threat directed against the state of Israel. And not only I'm speaking about the nuclear capabilities of Iran, at the same time, you have to know that Iran is trying to, you know, to pose itself in Syria, and time to time you can hear about aerial attacks on bases of Iran in Syria. And at the same time, Iran is the main supporter of Hezbollah in Lebanon. And you know, the very sensitive relations between Israel and the Lebanese regime, and with Hezbollah, Nasrallah, etc., and all the declarations that you can hear time and again about the Israeli enemy. And this is when I'm looking to the strategic arena in which Israel is located. You know, Gaza is a threat. It's not an existential threat to the very existence of the state of Israel. And from time to time, Israel can take actions in order to lower, you know, the threat from Gaza. But at the same time, don't forget, number one threat to Israel is from Iran and the nuclear military capabilities that they are going to develop.
But David, I must tell you, as you know, I always learn from you, and I know that everybody on this call will learn from you as well. But here's my retort to what you've said. Number one, in terms of strategic threats to the state of Israel, we cannot fail to tackle a threat just because there's a greater threat. In other words, we cannot continue to fail to bring about some resolution to the issue with the Gaza Strip just because there happens to be a larger threat over there in Iran. That's the first thing. As they say in the United States, one has to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. That's number one. Number two, if I was a listener in from Tehran to Colonel David Hacham talking now about the threat to our soldiers in the event of a large-scale campaign in the Gaza Strip, I would say not only has Israel lost its deterrence, but Israel has become deterred. It wants no part of the Gaza Strip. And here is where the two issues become amalgamated. The Gaza Strip, in the event that Iran gains a nuclear weapons capability, which I have to tell you, I have been of the mindset that they will for some time now. I will be very pleased if I'm proven wrong, but I actually believe that they will attain nuclear weapons capabilities. In that scenario, if there is a conflagration between Israel and the Gaza Strip, launched and precipitated by actions emanating from the Gaza Strip, Israel's right of reply and response and military return of fire will have to be calculated against the fact that the Iranians will say that they are readying a far more dangerous retaliation against Israel or Israeli assets or American assets, so on and so forth, given that they will have the diplomatic and military cover of nuclear weapons capabilities. Surely, given that, surely Israel should defang its weaker enemies while they are weak, so that they do not have to tackle that or deal with them in a repeated manner for years, if not decades to come, as I believe will be the case if Iran gains nuclear weapons capabilities, because it will become the guarantor, not just the funder, it will become the guarantor of the security of its proxies that are currently hard on Israel's borders.
Yeah, I understand your analysis, but at the same time, you have to know that when we are speaking now, Iran has not arrived yet to nuclear military capabilities completely. Iran is in the way. At the same time, I would like to tell you that I think that at the end of the day, first of all, I'm speaking about the alliance between Israel and the United States of America. I'm speaking about the last declarations being given by President Biden when he was in Israel, that he won't let Iran to reach nuclear military capabilities. And I would like to tell you something more than that. I don't know if you're familiar, but at the years 2010, 2011, there were like preparations being taken place by the Israeli Defense Forces to attack the nuclear, bases, nuclear military bases in Iran. I think at the end of the day, and I heard very much, the declarations given by the Israeli leaders, the Prime Minister Netanyahu, and afterwards Prime Minister Bennett, etc., speaking that they won't let Iran to be nuclearized with military, bombs. And I think at the end of the day, you have not to underestimate the Israeli, actions, which are going to be taken in this regard. And at the end of the day, Israel won't let Iran to develop nuclear military capabilities. This is a must, because this is like a red line from the Israeli point of view in terms of strategy, and Israel won't let it to Iran to do it. At the end of the day, time and again you hear about exercises being taken place by the Israeli Air Force. Mm-hmm. Only a couple of months ago, there was like more than 100 military combat planes being doing an exercise. In accordance with what I heard, this is like a preparation for an attack on Iran nuclear capabilities. I tell you, at the end of the day, this is a must, and this is the red line. And another time, I would like to emphasize something. You spoke about eliminating the threat from Gaza. As I've told you before, I was in Gaza. I know what Gaza is. I know what will be the price in terms of young lives of soldiers, of civilians entering to Gaza, to the refugee camps, etc., etc. And Gaza is not what you see on the surface. It's all underground,
Yes.
And this is why I think at the end of the day, when the government of Israel is making the analysis about what is a must now, what is not a must, what can be delayed or postponed to another period of time, I think this is the right decision to take. At the end of the day, believe me, that if Israel is going to be pushed to the corner and have to take, a decisive operation, decisive action, the government will take it. But now I think for these objective reasons, the decision taken by the government of Israel and by the new Prime Minister Yair Lapid is to stop the operation, the military operation in Gaza, and of course to watch and see and to follow, because we are not going to abandon Gaza. We are going to look at Gaza in a very, strong eyes. And this is, the right decision to take in this period of time vis-a-vis the threats from Gaza.
Well, David, I want to thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your response to me pushing you a little bit there. You almost convinced me, but not quite. But you made a good fist of it. And I just want to say that I know that you are among the global experts on this issue. So if we put my instinct into the context of your knowledge, my instinct pales in comparison to your sophisticated understanding of the subject. And it's part of the reason that I so enjoy interviewing you. And I want to thank you. We're going to move on to our next guest. But I do want to say to everybody, please do read David's brilliant analysis. It's on the MirYam Institute website, and listen to his podcasts also on the MirYam Institute website, which is brilliant. And you cannot help but learn from this individual. So David Hacham, thank you so very much. And I'm going to turn over to Yaakov Lappin for a couple of questions on the military side of the operation. And I appreciate your time as ever, David. Thank you.
Thank you, Benjamin. Thank you very much. It was my pleasure to be with you today, and looking forward to coming, meetings between us in the future.
Wonderful. Thanks, David. Thank you very much. Yaakov Lappin, is he there?
I'm here. I'm trying to get my camera switched on so far. Here we go.
There you go, Yaakov. Yaakov, great Zoom background. Fantastic background.
Thank you. You're revealing a state secret there, Benjamin. Most people think that this is a real office.
Well, it looks great. It looks great, and it's great to have you. And I mean, what an analysis from David Hacham. What a brilliant, brilliant mind, and someone who's been very much in the arena. And I wanted to turn to you to really add some color, some shade to his analysis. And on that note, David has stated that the impact of targeted assassination, something that I very much support, incidentally, very much support, is rather short-lived. You may have been listening in when I asked him about that. Now, the IDF has detained a key leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, and it's eliminated key commanders of the same organization in the Gaza Strip, as you also may have heard. That's excellent. I think it should continue. But you are someone who spends his days speaking to senior IDF brass. What do you feel, Yaakov, is Israel's long-term strategy in the Gaza Strip?
Israel's long-term strategy in the Gaza Strip is mowing the lawn. I think that's where it starts, and that's where it stops. If we're talking about strategy, the goal of the defense establishment is to bring in the lawnmower, so to speak, to the lawn of the Gaza Strip when terror organizations begin growing too tall and begin threatening Israeli cities. They apply world-leading, it has to be said, world-leading intelligence capabilities, world-leading firepower capabilities, and the marriage of these two things, this precision firepower and the intelligence, is what enables the state of Israel to buy itself periods of calm again and again. In the West Bank, it's a very different story, although there is also a lawn mowing operation, quote unquote, and by that I mean, again, buying times of quiet. There, because the IDF controls the territory, it's able to move into any area of the West Bank, and this is a huge difference between Gaza and the West Bank. Most of those operations are arrest operations, and only when those run into armed resistance do they turn into gun battles. And again, a very different situation where you have ground forces moving in. Very, very small numbers of ground forces are able to secure large areas. And I would also add that the arrest of Saadi, which triggered this entire escalation, I think if you look at the characteristics of that arrest, it wasn't in the middle of the night. It was approximately at around 10 p.m. That's when most of the area is still awake. It's a much higher risk to move into an arrest at that time. That suggests that there was very, very urgent intelligence about his activities. It suggests that he was in the middle of planning something very, very imminent. And I think that, that's why we saw that kind of drama linked to that arrest.
So of course, that I detest that phrase, mowing the lawn, right? I think it's a dreadful phrase. I don't think that it speaks to a strategy. I think it speaks to a lack of strategy. One can mow the lawn and say, I'm mowing the lawn, but eventually if you end up mowing the lawn at inconvenient hours or non-social hours, your neighbors start to say, stop doing that. And I wonder if we might see Israel's repeated defensive operations inside the Gaza Strip, if we might see that stress test the relationships that we have with countries such as the UAE, countries such as Morocco, Bahrain. I don't think that you carry that concern, right? I do, but I think that you take a different view to my own. You think that the Iranian threat trumps all other considerations and that those alliances will hold no matter what. But I think on mowing the lawn, to use that absolutely awful phrase, eventually our neighbors are going to start saying, you're making too much noise over there.
I mean, that's an interesting concern. And I think that, with everything, when we're talking about defense policy and defense strategy, what are the options? It always comes down to a menu of options, right? And when the cabinet meets, and in this case, we're hearing reports that actually the cabinet did not meet ahead of this operation because it was deemed to be an imminent threat, which is an interesting side topic in and of itself. But usually when the security cabinet meets, it's always presented with a list of options and a recommendation by the defense establishment. So if we're dealing with armed Palestinian terrorist organizations in the Gaza Strip who periodically present intolerable threats to the safety and security of the Israeli people, at the end of the day, we have two fundamental options here, right? We have rounds of fighting that are designed to replenish Israeli deterrence. That's option number one. And option number two is what you discussed with David, and it was a fascinating conversation to hear both of you. The occupation of the Gaza Strip, retaking the Gaza Strip, launching a Gaza-wide counter-terror campaign, which would last years, and then eventually either holding on to it or trying to find somebody else to pass that on to. Now, if we're worried about what our new Gulf allies may have to say about our counterterrorism operations, I think the worry would be 10 times larger if Israel became entangled in a full-blown Gaza war and the need to reconquer Gaza. So this is, again, this much smaller noise, if we can call it that, that would bother our new Gulf friends as opposed to option number two. And those are the only two options I see on the table as of now. I'm always looking for new ideas and new options, but I don't see on the table any additional options on that menu right now.
No, and I very much appreciate your response, and I take your point about a sustained campaign in the Gaza Strip and a holding of the Gaza Strip until such time as it's pacified as being the louder noise, creating the greater disturbance. But what about something else, Yaakov? What about if there is a lightning quick, aggressive, decisive series of operations throughout the Gaza Strip rather than this drip, drip, drip escalation that we see? That will quickly enable for the guns to stop, that will quickly bring quiet in the strip. And then we hold specific areas to prevent the smuggling of weapons, for example. We take up specific strongholds to prevent the funneling of weapons from outside the Gaza Strip into the Gaza Strip and from areas of the Gaza Strip to other areas of the Gaza Strip. You know the areas that I'm speaking about. Don't you think that that might help us to bring some sort of resolution to this issue?
First of all, I want to thank you for having a strategic dialogue here, because I think that this is what we're missing. We need to have a conversation about these options at the national level, at the international level of all people who are concerned for Israel's security. And I think it's very important to have this conversation. And I'm glad that you're raising this. In terms of a lightning quick operation, I'm personally skeptical that an option like that really exists when it comes to the Gaza Strip, and I'll tell you why. If I look at the last time that we vacated a Palestinian population and an area where terrorist organizations took over, I would be bringing myself back to Operation Defensive Shield, right, and the second Intifada. And Operation Defensive Shield, as you know so well, was launched after the Park Hotel bombing in Netanya, and this was one of the bloodiest months in Israel's history. I mean, the reality was very difficult here. We had suicide bombings going off constantly. Jenin had become a terrorist hornet's nest far more than it is today. And that operation began in 2002, but actually went on until 2005. So we're talking about 3 years that it took the IDF, even after it physically retook the West Bank cities. It had to stay there for 3 more years until the West Bank became pacified. And this would be an easier operation, and this was not an easy operation in any way, and we lost precious lives in that operation, and lots of families, are still mourning their loved ones, and it was an absolute necessary operation for Israel's security. There's no question about that. I think an operation like that would be significantly smaller than an operation in Gaza, because if we only did sort of a half operation in Gaza, a lightning quick operation, that would mean that Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the other terrorist factions are still able to launch attacks, snipe, hit and run, tunnels, and they would need to be pacified. And the rocket launching would also continue. If we don't control the whole of Gaza, they would continue to launch rockets and mortars. So I would struggle to see how an operation like that could be small. I think once ground forces go in, yes, it is theoretically possible to aim for a more modest goal, such as neutralizing Hamas's military wing, but let's say not, taking out its civilian government or police force. Perhaps that's something that could be looked at. But even an operation like that, I think, is a matter of months at the very least, and not anything less than that.
But when I speak about lightning fast, I want to explain that a little bit more carefully. So we've seen 2 modes of operating in the Gaza Strip. We've seen it where we've just seen most recently, where we decapitate specific high-level targets, right? Literally and figuratively, from the Gaza Strip, and then the rockets come and we defend against the rockets and so forth. And we've also seen a completely different mode of operating, which is that we ratchet up pressure on the Gaza Strip. We don't target the heads of Hamas or the heads of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, but there's a slow build. The rocket fire intensifies, our movements intensify, multi-story buildings start being toppled by us, so on and so forth. I'm saying the beginning phases of this ought to be swift, decisive, rapid, so that the attention of the international community and the pressure that comes through a slow build, that is actually quite short-lived and less impactful. And after that, then we can go through the pacifying of the Strip in a manner similar to that of Defensive Shield, because to your point, Defensive Shield was not an easy operation. It did last for several years, but look at the results. Look at these incredible results. We do not, thankfully, receive suicide bombings in the state of Israel. The ability of the Israel Defense Forces to operate rather freely throughout Judea and Samaria is something that's very positive. There is, though I'm always skeptical of it, there is a level of cooperation between the IDF and the Palestinian security forces as well that are run and operated by Fatah. So there is a gap here in our methodology. I don't think that a swift, decisive attack on high-level targets and other lower-level targets, but all terrorists and so forth, all members of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, I don't think that that's been front-loaded. I think it's always been a drip, and I think that that's actually impeded us.
I think that, the fundamental question here is what happens afterwards, because let's say, that we launch an operation like this, and I'm not ruling out, the merits of such a maneuver if in the future the situation again becomes intolerable, which it surely will. But to me, the fundamental question is what happens after that? Do we withdraw? Because if we withdraw, I think, the rule of thumb when it comes to our military and strategic experience as a state is any area that we don't control falls under the control of Iranian-backed terrorists, and it becomes a rocket launching pad. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about southern Lebanon, it doesn't matter if we're talking about the Gaza Strip, Syria, parts of Syria, if we had sort of abandoned that arena, it would be the host of a second Hezbollah today. So, if we don't have a level of control and a constant ability to launch continuous security operations in that area, it will simply rebuild itself. And I think that's the reality that we're dealing with right now. And even in Gaza, even if we launch a very effective, much wider scale military operation, and Gaza in many ways is any war planner's nightmare. As soon as you're talking about ground forces, we have to acknowledge in some ways, even though Lebanon is obviously a much greater challenge in the form of Hezbollah, in terms of actual fighting environment and fighting arena, the dense urban environment of the Gaza Strip is an extremely difficult place for ground forces to operate, whether it's armored corps, whether it's infantry. They're going to be surrounded by, 360 degrees by this mix of civilians who just want to survive, and combatants who will be using those civilians as human shields and multi-story buildings and tunnels. We got a small taste of that in 2014. So it's extremely complicated. Obviously, there would be many, many casualties. And then after that, if we withdraw, I don't see any way that the situation doesn't go back to the status quo where we are now. And I think that's the conundrum that we're all grappling with, all of us who hold the security of this country dear to our hearts.
So Yaakov, talking about the status quo, there's been a shift in the status quo, but not in the sense that you just mentioned, which is the status quo of the outlook of the Israel Defense Forces. And I'm sorry, we only have about 10 more minutes, Yaakov, so I want to try and get through all of the things I wanted to ask you. But it used to be the case that Hamas was held exclusively and fully responsible for whatever transpired in the Gaza Strip, for whatever was launched toward the state of Israel from the Gaza Strip. And there's been something of a U-turn. Israel and the IDF, in this case, in this most recent round of fighting, went to great lengths, including from the spokesperson of the Israel Defense Forces, Dover Tzahal, great lengths to express that the target of our strikes within the Gaza Strip is exclusively Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It is not Hamas. What accounts for that shift?
I think that in many ways we're seeing a rerun, and I think it's important to mention this, of the year 2019. The year 2019 was the first time, that was the precedent, where Israel waged a 3-day campaign against exclusively Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It began very similarly with a targeted assassination of their northern Gaza commander, Baha Abu al-Atta. And I think that since that time, the defense establishment realized that it has this option because Hamas views Palestinian Islamic Jihad as a thorn in its side, as a competitor, as an entity that really gets it entangled into confrontations when it doesn't choose to do so. And that's not because Hamas is not a radical Islamist jihadist organization interested in Israel's destruction. It very much is, but it also has to juggle its role as a regime and a government, and it has much longer term calculations. It wants to take over the West Bank. So it's in a state of competition with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And the Israeli defense establishment has realized that there are times when it can drive a wedge in between these two organizations, and Hamas will sit on the sidelines because it's in Hamas's interest for Israel to weaken PIJ and thereby actually strengthen Hamas's rule of Gaza. And it's one of those times where, realpolitik, you have a merger of interests between Israel and Hamas, as strange as it is to say, but that is what has happened. We have to put that fact on the table and not run away from it. It's exactly what has been guiding the dynamics of this event. And Israel did this in 2019. It just did it again. And again, the fact that Hamas sat on the side proves the theory. It proves the theory correct. Yes, Hamas wanted Palestinian Islamic Jihad to be put in its place. And I would also take this opportunity to direct readers to a very good paper on this topic that we also just put up by Colonel Grisha Yakubovich on the MirYam Institute. He discusses this dynamics in very good detail. So that's the theory, and it has proven itself at the tactical level.
Yeah, and people can read that paper on the MirYam Institute website, on our homepage, and also on the commentary section under Grisha Yakubovich, who was a former colonel in the coordination of government activities in the territories, namely Gaza Strip, Judea, and Samaria. So, Yaakov, I wonder if this bodes for a broader shift. You'll recall that where Hezbollah is concerned, Israel has repeatedly said that it will hold all of Lebanon responsible for any hostilities coming from within Lebanese territories, not just Hezbollah. Do you think that this specified, pared down responsibility that we're seeing in Gaza, with the positive effect that you've expressed and described, namely the splitting, the dividing of one force against another force, in the case of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, do you think that might translate onto the Lebanese map?
That's an excellent question, Benjamin. I think that the dynamics there are a little bit different in the sense that I think when Israel says that Lebanon will be held responsible, what it's really saying is it's telling Hezbollah, look, if you think that your host, and we view Hezbollah as a sort of infection that's inside of a host state called Lebanon, and we're telling Hezbollah, if you think your host is going to be spared the carnage of a third Lebanon war, you should think again. And Hezbollah needs to hear that message because it has political interests in the state of Lebanon. It has, like Hamas, several identities that it juggles. It's an Iranian proxy, it's a terrorist army, but it's also heavily embedded and involved with the Lebanese state and the Lebanese political affairs, and it's not immune to pressure from Lebanese people. So I think that message is really part of the Israeli deterrent posture that's aimed towards Hezbollah. And the reason I say that is because the Lebanese state has no ability to decide what Hezbollah does. It has no ability to influence in terms of, direct decision-making what Hezbollah does. So any messages of deterrence that are sent towards the northern direction, I think are aimed at Dahya, at Hezbollah's headquarters, at Nasrallah and his team. And they're the ones who are the intended audience of these messages, that their host will be very badly damaged, just as they would be in a third Lebanon war.
So I'm very concerned that, and I've spoken to you about this offline as well, not just now, but over the years. I'm very, very concerned that we're falling into the trap of groupthink when it comes to how to deal with the Gaza Strip. The notion that our military planners repeatedly and seemingly as one state that there is nothing that can be done to reduce the frequency of these escalations is very, very troubling for me. And I'll give you an example as to why. And I alluded to this somewhat with regard to David Hacham and my conversation with him. Look, if you have a situation where rockets are being fired from the Gaza Strip and you have a nuclear capable Iran, and Iran, that's, in my opinion, is not seeking to launch a nuclear weapon direct from its territory onto the state of Israel. I wouldn't rule that out as a possibility, but it doesn't need to do that, right? Because it has these proxies. If it were to give nuclear capabilities, tipped weapons, so forth, to Hezbollah, to our north, and there should be a conflagration from our south coming from the Gaza Strip, we are not going to have the freedom of movement to deal with that. There will be a massive, massive impact that will come in the case that Hezbollah becomes the possessor of non-conventional weapons, or dare I say it, nuclear-tipped weapons. Don't you think that we have to come up with something a little bit more strategic than, to bring this conversation full circle, mowing the lawn?
I think that, as they say sometimes in sports, everything is a matter of timing. If you look at the defense establishment as an organization, and it does not have infinite resources, it has to think about how it focuses its resources. If it made the decision that now is the time to prioritize a potential strike on Iran's nuclear program, if Iran crosses a certain threshold, a certain red line, which, by the way, Israel has not made public what that red line is. It has, dropped a few hints, but we haven't had anything explicit. But if that's the top priority, and knowing as we do that such an action would very likely lead to a war with Hezbollah as well, which is the most serious conventional threat, military threat to the state of Israel, it would be my belief that defense planners are saying we should put Gaza at the bottom of the priority list because we need to be ready for a war with Iran, with Hezbollah, and those would take up the lion's share of our capabilities. I mean, getting bogged down in an open-ended Gaza operation now could simply act as a huge distraction and possibly could serve Iran. And, while we're busy with Gaza, we would have to be taking our eyes potentially off the ball while Iran is, pushing through its nuclear program. So, there's a way of looking at this upside down in a totally opposite way, which is we need to be ready for the big threat and put Gaza down in its place. But what I would say in agreement with your analysis is that the right way to look at Gaza, I think, and there's a certain delusion I think that we're currently experiencing. We just had a 3-day conflict with Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the weakest of Israel's enemies. Of all the adversaries that we have to face, this was the weakest one. And Palestinian Islamic Jihad fought a war with Israel purely based on firepower. This was a firepower war, right? There was no ground movement here involved, no tanks, no infantry. It was our air force versus their rocket force. There were no troops or ground formations involved. That's not what a full-scale war will ever look like in our region. If we end up in a full-scale war, there will be ground formations. The level of firepowers that the cities here will experience will be so much more severe than anything we've experienced out of Gaza. And the way to view Gaza, I think, the real threat from Gaza is that it would join a multi-arena assault on Israel. If we end up in a situation where we're dealing with Gaza, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, Iraq, militias in Iraq, and the entire Iranian axis plus its allies, that's where Gaza, I think, really becomes a problem, as a serious distraction and as a serious problem that would take away from Israel's ability to focus on greater threats. And I think that that's what we need to think about. That's what we need to plan for. And in terms of, Iran and its nuclear intentions, I think what Iran wants to do is to be able to one day extend a nuclear shield over its proxies, so that the next time that they launch this multi-arena assault on Israel, we would be deterred in their perception from fully retaliating. I think that's their end goal, and Israel has to do everything possible, including potentially a preemptive war if that's necessary, to deny them that ability. And I think that comes back to the timing issue that I mentioned earlier.
No, I completely agree with the ending of that response, Yaakov. I think that's the reason that I'm so concerned that we allow this force buildup to continue. We allow them to be wounded but not killed off. I'm talking about the terror organizations. We allow them to rebuild because eventually they will constitute part of it's not quite a circle, but something of a noose that will be tightened around Israel. And I'm sure that the defense establishment are thinking about it. I'm sure that they are considering it, but I also feel that they just may be underestimating it. I think that they're underestimating its potency as a component within a broader alliance of threats that are coalescing around a singular goal, which is to harm, damage, and even destroy the safety and security, and if they had their way, the existence of the state of Israel, which won't be the case. But I think that does not stop them from holding that ambition. So, Yaakov, I'm afraid that we have to end it here. I just want to thank you so very much for this interview. Thank you also for typing your responses to our guests' questions. Thank you to our guests for listening to us today. Thank you if you're listening on the podcast or postcast or watching on JBS. We really appreciate it. And I want to extend my profound thanks to you, Yaakov, and to the previous guest, David Hacham, for continuing my education, and also to my colleagues at the MirYam Institute. Thank you very much indeed. And from me, it's over and out for now.
Thank you.